The man standing at the ranch gates told me my inheritance was cursed and that everyone who'd lived here had died screaming. But what I found in the abandoned barn proved he was hiding something far worse than ghosts. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button real quick. Tomorrow, I'm sharing a story about a discovery that'll shake you to your core. I was 21 years old when the lawyer's letter arrived at the group home, informing me that my great aunt Patricia, a woman I'd met exactly once when I was 7, had passed away and left me her entire ranch in Montana. 300 acres of land, a farmhouse, livestock, and apparently, according to the handwritten note tucked inside the legal documents, a chance at the life you deserve. I barely remembered Aunt Patricia. What I did recall was a tall woman with silver-streaked hair who'd visited the group home one afternoon, held my hands across a cafeteria table, and told me she was sorry she couldn't take me in. She lived too far away, she'd said. Her health wasn't good. The ranch was too isolated for a child. All the usual excuses that meant I wasn't wanted enough. After that visit, I'd received birthday cards every year, always with a $20 bill inside and a brief message. Stay strong. Your time is coming. I'd saved every card in a shoebox under my bed, not out of sentimentality, but because they were proof that somewhere out there, someone knew I existed. The letter from the attorney, a man named Richard Foster, explained that Aunt Patricia had died 3 months earlier at 74. She'd left specific instructions that I wasn't to be contacted until after her estate was settled and all arrangements were made. The ranch was mine, free and clear, along with a bank account containing $18,000 to help me get started. I sat in my tiny room at Riverside Group Home, staring at the documents and feeling like I was reading about someone else's life. 300 acres, a house, money. After aging out of foster care with nothing but a duffel bag and a voucher for transitional housing, I was suddenly a property owner. My caseworker, Ms. Reynolds, was cautiously optimistic. "This could be really good for you, Jamie," she said, reviewing the paperwork. "But Montana is far, and ranch life isn't easy. Are you sure you want to do this?" I'd never been sure of anything in my life. But what was the alternative? Stay in the city, working minimum wage jobs, and living in shared apartments with people I didn't trust? At least the ranch was mine. At least it was a chance. 2 weeks later, I was on a bus heading north, with everything I owned packed into 2 bags. The journey took 36 hours through landscapes that gradually transformed from urban sprawl to endless fields and eventually to rolling hills dotted with pine trees. Montana was bigger and emptier than I'd imagined, the sky stretching overhead like a vast blue dome. The bus dropped me in a small town called Clearwater, population 943 according to the faded sign at the town limits. Mr. Foster had arranged for someone to meet me at the general store and drive me out to the ranch. That someone turned out to be a grizzled man in his 60s named Carl, who introduced himself as the nearest neighbor, living about 8 miles down the road from my new property. He loaded my bags into his truck without much conversation, just a grunt of acknowledgement and a long, appraising look that made me feel like I was being measured and found wanting. The drive to the ranch took 40 minutes on increasingly rough roads. Carl finally spoke when we turned onto a narrow gravel driveway. "Your aunt was a good woman, kept to herself mostly, but she was fair and honest. This land meant everything to her. I wanted to ask why she'd left it to me, a relative she'd barely known. But before I could formulate the question, we rounded a bend and the ranch came into view. The main house was a two-story structure with weathered wood siding and a wraparound porch that sagged slightly on one corner. Behind it stood a large red barn, several smaller outbuildings, and pastures enclosed by wooden fencing that stretched toward distant tree lines. Everything looked tired and worn, but solid, real, and standing right at the gates, blocking the entrance, was a man I'd never seen before. Carl slowed the truck, his expression darkening. "That's Mason Webb. Been hanging around since Patricia died, claiming all sorts of nonsense." Mason was probably in his late 40s, tall and thin, with dark hair going gray at the temples. He stepped forward as we approached, and Carl rolled down his window with obvious reluctance. "She here to stay, then?" Mason asked, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "That's none of your business," Carl said flatly. "Move aside." But Mason didn't move. Instead, he walked around to my side of the truck, and I found myself looking up into pale blue eyes that held something between concern and warning. "You're Patricia's niece? The one from the city?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Then you need to know something before you set foot on this property." His voice dropped lower, almost to a whisper. "This ranch is cursed, has been for 3 generations. Everyone who's lived here has died badly. Your great-grandmother, your grandmother, now Patricia, all of them screaming in their sleep, haunted by something in that barn. If you've got any sense, you'll sell this place and never look back." Carl exploded. "Get out of here with that garbage, Mason. You've been spreading those lies for months, trying to scare off anyone who might buy the property. We all know you want this land for yourself." Mason's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to save her life. Patricia knew the truth at the end. That's why she was so desperate to get rid of the place. She told me herself that something evil lived here, that it had been feeding on the women in her family for generations." "Aunt Patricia had dementia," Carl shot back. "She was confused and scared, but that doesn't make your stories true." I found my voice finally, though it came out shakier than I wanted. "What do you mean, feeding on them?" Mason leaned closer to the truck window. "Ask around town about the screaming, about the way your great-grandmother was found, clawing at the barn walls, about your grandmother who set fire to her own bedroom, trying to kill something no one else could see. Patricia was the strongest of them, lasted the longest, but in the end, it got to her too. The thing in that barn wants blood from the women in your family, and now that you're here, it'll come for you next." My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. "If it's so dangerous, why do you want the property?" He blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "I don't want it for myself. I want to burn the barn down and salt the earth. End this curse before it claims another life." Carl had heard enough. He revved the engine. "Last warning, Mason. Move, or I'll move you." For a long moment, Mason didn't budge. Then he stepped back slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Don't say I didn't warn you. When the nightmares start, when you hear it calling from the barn, remember, I tried to save you." Carl drove through the gates, muttering under his breath about fool superstitions and opportunistic vultures. But I couldn't stop thinking about Mason's words, the screaming, the clawing, the thing that fed on women in my family. The house was unlocked, exactly as Mr. Foster had said it would be. Carl helped me carry my bags inside, then gave me a brief tour, pointing out the basics. The kitchen with its ancient stove, the living room with furniture covered in dust sheets, the 3 bedrooms upstairs. Everything was clean but untouched, frozen in time from the day Aunt Patricia had been taken to the hospital for the last time. "I'll check on you tomorrow," Carl said as he prepared to leave. "Don't let Mason's nonsense get in your head. He's been trying to buy this land for years, claimed he wanted to expand his cattle operation. When Patricia refused to sell, he started with the curse stories, thinking he could scare her into accepting a lowball offer. After she died, he tried the same tactics with the estate. Mr. Foster shut him down, but clearly he hasn't given up." After Carl left, I stood on the porch watching the sun sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The ranch was beautiful in the fading light, peaceful and quiet except for the wind rustling through the pines. But I couldn't stop staring at the barn. It was larger than I'd realized, 3 stories tall, with a peaked roof and wide doors that hung slightly open. Even from a distance, even in the gentle evening light, there was something about it that felt wrong. Not evil, exactly, but heavy, waiting. I told myself I was being ridiculous, letting Mason's theatrical warnings get under my skin. Curses weren't real. Haunted barns were the stuff of movies and campfire stories. I was a rational person who'd survived 16 years in the foster system by keeping my head down and not believing in fairy tales. But that night, alone in Aunt Patricia's house for the first time, I heard the screaming. It started around 2 in the morning, pulling me from restless sleep. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a fox or coyote. But as I lay there in the darkness, my heart hammering against my ribs, I realized the sound was coming from the direction of the barn, and it sounded almost human. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, creeping downstairs with my pulse racing. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, to lock the doors and wait for morning. But I needed to know. I needed to understand what was making that sound. The screaming had stopped by the time I reached the back door. The night was perfectly silent, not even crickets chirping. I stood there for a full 5 minutes, my hand on the doorknob, debating whether to investigate or retreat to my room. Then I heard it again, not screaming this time, but a low, rhythmic thumping coming from inside the barn. What comes next is something I never saw coming. Stick with me and make sure you subscribe. I walked across the yard toward the barn, my phone's flashlight cutting a weak beam through the darkness. The main doors were still hanging open, exactly as they'd been that afternoon. The thumping grew louder as I approached, steady and deliberate, like something heavy being dragged across a wooden floor. "Hello?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. The thumping stopped. I stood at the barn entrance, shining my light into the cavernous interior. The beam illuminated old farm equipment, hay bales, and wooden support beams that stretched up into shadows. Everything was covered in dust and cobwebs, untouched for months or maybe years. But in the far corner, I saw movement. My breath caught as I focused the light on the spot. There, partially hidden behind a stack of crates, something was shifting. I could see what looked like fabric, dark and heavy, swaying slightly despite the lack of wind. Every rational part of my brain told me to leave, to go back to the house and call Carl or even the police. But I'd spent my whole life running from things that scared me, letting other people make decisions about my life. This ranch was mine. Whatever was in this barn, I needed to face it. I moved deeper into the barn, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. As I got closer to the corner, I realized what I was seeing. Not a monster or a ghost, but a tarp covering something large and rectangular. And beneath the tarp, something was moving. I grabbed the edge of the canvas and pulled. The tarp fell away, revealing a cage, but not a cage for animals. This was bigger, cruder, built from welded metal and reinforced bars. And inside, pressing against the door, was a woman. She looked about 50, with matted hair and wild eyes that blinked against the sudden light. She was wearing clothes that had once been nice, a blouse and slacks that were now filthy and torn. When she saw me, she let out a sob of relief so raw it made my chest ache. "Please," she gasped, "please get me out. He's been keeping me here for months. He'll be back soon to check on me. Please." My hand shook as I examined the cage door. It was secured with a heavy padlock, too strong to break without tools. "Who did this to you? Who's keeping you here?" "Mason Webb," she said, and my blood ran cold. "He's obsessed with this ranch. He thinks there's something valuable hidden on the property, something worth killing for. He's been searching for years, and when your aunt wouldn't sell to him, he started the curse stories to drive down the property value. When that didn't work, when she still refused, he got desperate. I thought of Mason at the gates, his warnings about the curse, his insistence that I leave. He hadn't been trying to protect me. He'd been trying to keep me away from the barn where he'd imprisoned this woman. "What's your name?" I asked, already pulling out my phone to call for help. "Sarah Mitchell. I'm a real estate appraiser. Mason hired me 6 months ago to assess the ranch property. When I told him it wasn't worth what he thought, when I said there was nothing particularly valuable about the land, he locked me in here. He said I knew too much, that I couldn't leave until he found what he was looking for." My call to 911 went through, and I gave the dispatcher our location, explaining as calmly as I could that I'd found a kidnapping victim on my property. Then I called Carl, who answered on the second ring despite the late hour. "Mason Webb has been keeping a woman prisoner in my barn," I said without preamble. "The police are on their way, but you need to get here now. If he realizes we've found her—" "I'm coming," Carl interrupted. "Lock yourself in the house and wait for the police." But I couldn't leave Sarah alone in that cage. Instead, I searched the barn for something to break the lock. I found a sledgehammer among the tools and brought it back, apologizing before I started swinging. It took 6 tries, but the lock finally shattered. Sarah stumbled out of the cage, her legs weak from months of confinement. I helped her to the barn entrance, where she could breathe fresh air, and that's when we saw headlights turning into the driveway. For a terrifying moment, I thought it was Mason, but the vehicle was Carl's truck, arriving faster than should have been possible. He must have been speeding the entire way. Carl took one look at Sarah, and his face went pale. "My God, we all thought you'd left town. Mason said you'd finished your assessment and moved on to another job." "He's been bringing me food and water," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Just enough to keep me alive." He kept saying he was close to finding it, that he just needed a little more time to search the property. He was convinced your aunt had hidden something valuable. Maybe gold or artifacts from her ancestors. He'd been breaking into the barn at night for years, digging holes in the foundation, tearing apart walls. The sound I'd heard, the thumping, it must have been Mason searching even tonight, not realizing I was awake and alert. Police cars arrived 15 minutes later, their sirens shattering the quiet Montana night. Sheriff Davis listened to Sarah's story, examined the cage, and immediately put out an alert for Mason Webb. Officers searched the barn thoroughly, documenting everything, including the holes Mason had dug throughout the structure, damaging the foundation in his obsessive search for treasure that didn't exist. They found evidence that Mason had been living in a small room he'd built in the barn's loft, complete with surveillance equipment pointed at the house. He'd been watching the property for years, documenting Aunt Patricia's routines, planning his opportunity. The curse stories were brilliant in a sick way, Sheriff Davis explained, as dawn broke over the ranch. He'd been spreading them for years, making sure everyone in town knew about the supposed curse on the women in your family. When your great-grandmother died of a heart attack, he claimed the curse killed her. When your grandmother had a stroke and knocked over a candle, starting the fire that killed her, he said she was trying to escape the curse. And when Patricia developed dementia in her final months, he used her confusion to reinforce the legend. But why? I asked. Why go to such lengths for a ranch that's worth maybe $300,000? The sheriff pulled out a folder he'd found in Mason's hideout. Inside were old newspaper clippings and handwritten notes, all about a stagecoach robbery from 1876. According to the articles, bandits had stolen $50,000 in gold coins and vanished into the Montana wilderness. The robbery had taken place near where my ranch now stood. Mason convinced himself the gold was buried somewhere on this property, Sheriff Davis said. He'd been researching the robbery for 20 years, cross-referencing old maps and property records. When he realized this land lined up with where he thought the bandits might have hidden the loot, he became obsessed. He tried to buy it legitimately, but your aunt refused every offer, so he got creative. Mason was arrested 2 days later, trying to flee to Canada. They found him with maps of the ranch, digging equipment, and a detailed journal outlining his plans. Sarah's testimony, combined with the evidence from the barn, ensured he'd spend the next 20 years in prison. As for the gold, a thorough search by professional archaeologists and metal detector enthusiasts found nothing. The treasure, if it ever existed, wasn't on my land. Mason had destroyed parts of my barn and imprisoned an innocent woman chasing a legend that was probably never true. But something else came out of the investigation. In Mason's journal, officers found entries from the months before Aunt Patricia's death. He'd been breaking into her house, moving things, making noises, trying to convince her she was losing her mind. The dementia was real, but Mason had accelerated her decline, using her confusion to make her believe the curse stories he'd invented. Your aunt's final months were tortured because of him, Mr. Foster told me when he came to the ranch to check on me. She became paranoid, stopped sleeping, kept talking about evil in the barn. We all thought it was the dementia, but Mason was gaslighting her, making her final days a nightmare. I stood in the barn a week after Mason's arrest, looking at the cage that had held Sarah prisoner and the holes that had damaged the foundation. The structure would need serious repairs, maybe even partial rebuilding. But I wasn't afraid of it anymore. This barn wasn't cursed. It was just a building that a desperate, greedy man had violated in his search for imaginary treasure. The screaming I'd heard that first night had been Sarah. The thumping had been Mason searching in the darkness. The only evil here was human, and it was now locked away. I hired a construction crew to repair the barn, making it stronger than before. Sarah, recovered and freed, became an unexpected friend. She helped me understand the property's actual value and potential, teaching me about ranch management and connecting me with resources for new landowners. Carl and his wife Linda adopted me into their family, inviting me for dinners and teaching me about Montana life. The community that had seemed so distant at first welcomed me once they realized I wasn't going to run from Mason's lies. I discovered that Aunt Patricia had left me more than just land and money. In her bedroom, I found journals documenting her life on the ranch, her struggles, her joys, and her regrets about not being more involved in my life. She'd followed my progress through the foster system, saved every school report my caseworkers had sent her, and planned carefully for the day I'd age out and need a home. "I can't raise a child," she'd written in one entry from 12 years earlier, "but I can give her a foundation, a place to belong when she's ready. I hope she'll forgive me for not being there, and I hope this land will give her the stability I couldn't provide." Reading those words, I understood. Aunt Patricia had loved me the only way she knew how, from a distance, by preserving something solid for my future. The ranch wasn't just property. It was her apology, her hope, and her belief that I deserved better than what life had given me. 6 months after inheriting the ranch, I stood in the repaired barn with Sarah, Carl, and Linda, celebrating the completion of the renovations. The structure was sound again, the foundation reinforced, the damage from Mason's obsession erased. "What are you going to do with it?" Sarah asked. I'd been thinking about that question for weeks. The barn was too large for just storage, too significant to leave empty. And then I remembered all the kids still in the system, all the people like me who aged out with nowhere to go and no idea how to build a life. "I'm going to create a program," I said slowly, the idea crystallizing as I spoke. "A place where young people aging out of foster care can come and learn ranch skills, get hands-on training, earn certifications, give them the same kind of foundation Aunt Patricia gave me." Carl grinned. "That's perfect. This land was meant to help people. Your aunt would love that." It took another year to get the proper licensing and funding, but the Patricia Henderson Ranch Training Program opened with its first group of 6 young people, all between 18 and 22, all looking for a chance. We taught them animal husbandry, land management, equipment operation, and business skills. Some stayed for a few months before moving on to other opportunities. Others, like Marcus, a 19-year-old from Seattle, found a calling and stayed on as permanent staff. The program grew, funded by grants, donations, and eventually by the organic beef operation we started. The ranch became known not for curses or tragedy, but for transformation and hope. 5 years after that bus ride to Montana, I stood at the same gates where Mason had tried to scare me away. But now those gates had a new sign: Henderson Ranch, building futures, honoring the past. The ranch had taught me that sometimes the stories people tell about a place, about a family, about a person, are just stories. The truth is usually simpler, more human, and more complicated than legends suggest. There was no curse on the women in my family, just ordinary people dealing with ordinary tragedies, their stories twisted by a greedy man into something supernatural. The real curse would have been believing his lies and walking away from the gift Aunt Patricia had left me. I think about Mason sometimes, serving his sentence, and probably still convinced the gold is hidden somewhere on my land. He wasted decades of his life chasing a fantasy, and in the process, he hurt real people and destroyed real relationships, all for treasure that never existed. Meanwhile, I'd found the real treasure, a home, a purpose, and a community. I'd discovered that belonging isn't about blood or perfect family histories. It's about choosing to stay, to build, to contribute, and to help others find their way. Thank you so much for being part of this journey with me. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had someone try to scare you away from something that turned out to be exactly what you needed? Or maybe you've discovered that a family story you believed turned out to be completely different from the truth. Share your experiences below. And don't forget to check out the 2 stories on your screen right now. Each one is about unexpected discoveries and the courage it takes to face the truth. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.